Welcome to the Visual Studio 2010 and .NET Framework 4 training course. In this video, I'd like to introduce you to the various enhancements and improvements coming in the managed language space in Visual Studio 2010. Specifically, we're going to discuss C#4, Visual Basic 10, and a new language on the scene, F#. So when I personally like to think about C#4 and VB10 and what's the real benefit of using C#4 and VB10, it really boils down to the topic of essence versus ceremony. This is something that programmers nowadays are becoming a lot more passionate about. This idea that normally a language or a compiler might introduce a lot of ceremony, a lot of hoops that you have to go through before you can actually express the true intent that you want with your program. What we really want to do is break down that barrier. We want to make it a lot easier to express the true intent and true meaning of a program through expressing it directly in code, minimizing those hoops that you normally have to jump through as a developer. Now, there's various ways that we're actually boiling down this ceremony to get down to the essence of the code itself in both C#4 and Visual Basic 10. Now in C#4, two features that are being introduced are named and optional parameters. And for me personally, I personally think that C#4, when it comes to named and optional parameters, they go together very well. When you put the use of named and optional parameters together, it allows you to boil down and remove a lot of overhead that you may have needed to do before. For example, think about method overloading. Sometimes as developers, we will code up a method and then one method might want to default a value to some value. Well, in order to default it, we would use method overloading, where we create one method that accepts, perhaps one parameter, and then another method that accepts two parameters. And they have the same name. The only difference is the method with one parameter is calling the method with two parameters, specifying a default value for something. So now we've introduced this having to code up this entire other method to explain that what we really want is just, if the user doesn't specify a parameter, default it to some value. Now, using optional parameters in C#4, we can do this very easily. We can simply set the incoming parameter of a method to some value and now not have to jump through that hoop of requiring this extra method via method overloading to introduce this concept into our program. And then the next one is dynamic. There's a lot of discussion out there around the introduction of this new dynamic keyword in C#4. This is something that is really necessary or very powerful when it comes to interoping with other technologies. This could be interop with COM, this could be interop with other dynamic languages, perhaps IronPython and IronRuby. When we're stuck in C#4, let's say 3 and before, being in such a statically typed system, if we have to communicate with a dynamically typed language, it becomes very difficult to express the true intent of the code without having to jump through, do a lot of reflection code and everything where we're having to walk stuff manually at runtime. And that causes some problems when we're having to do that. It's very error prone, and frankly, there's a lot of gook that we have to express in our code that has nothing to do with the problem we're solving at hand. We may want to call one method on an object, and simply because we're trying to interop with dynamic now we're having to grab the type. We're having to grab some method infos. We're having to actually invoke method infos directly and then do the casting ourselves. That becomes a big pain. But with the new dynamic keyword, we can flag a variable as dynamic and then say, hey, DLR, the dynamic language runtime, you handle how you know to actually bind this to the dynamic objects and call the various things that we're trying to call. Once again, we don't have to jump through all that stuff. There's a lot of unnecessary code that we no longer have to write to get straight to the point. We cut straight to the chase and go directly to the dynamic object itself and let the runtime handle all the dispatch that we're needing in order to communicate with those dynamic systems. Now let's talk about the Visual Basic 10 side. Visual Basic 10 actually has several improvements when it comes to boiling down the ceremony needed when writing code into the pure essence. And these are ones that I'm very excited about. The first one is auto-implemented properties. C# developers are already familiar with auto-implemented properties. Well, this is something that's coming to VB now with the release of Visual Basic 10. The ability that if you're needing a property in your class and you need a backing field behind that property, you no longer have to explicitly write out the backing field and write the getters and setters. You can create the property in just an empty get and set, and bam, you're ready to go like you do in C#. In Visual Basic, it's even more simple. There's even aspects of how Visual Basic has implemented that honestly will make some of you C# developers jealous. I know I'm jealous when I'm writing C# code doing auto-implemented properties. There's some stuff I can do in VB that I can't do in C#. Now, the next two are very important. With the introduction of the last round of languages, there was a new capability of lambdas expressed in our languages now. And a lot of frameworks are starting to take full advantage of this. This ability to write code in a more functional style. You even look at a framework like Link, which makes heavy use of these lambda expressions, and your code becomes much more elegant. It gets straight to the point using this functional programming style to where you don't have to jump through a lot of the typing or object-oriented hoops to express, a simple query against, let's say, an in-memory collection of objects. It becomes very easy when using this lambda style to program in a very functional way in an object-oriented language like C# or Visual Basic. Well, Visual Basic with VB9 was painful to write and target some of these frameworks. And that was because with VB9, unlike C#, there wasn't the capability of having lambda expressions that actually had multiple statements in them. There wasn't the capability of having a lambda expression that had a statement that didn't return a value, that did its work through side effects. That stuff wasn't possible in VB9. But with VB10, we're bringing that to Visual Basic developers. So using libraries that are much more reliant on lambdas like Link and like parallel extensions and like perhaps some of the open source libraries out there, this is going to become very powerful for Visual Basic developers to embrace as well. And then lastly, it sounds like a small feature, but especially combined with multi-line lambdas, it's going to be a very important feature, is implicit line continuations. Yes, VB developers, you no longer have to have that underscore at the end of every line when it's a multi-line statement. You don't have to worry about that anymore. Most of the time, the VB compiler will take care of that for you and automatically know to do the right thing. Another way that we're making these languages smarter in order to enable the developer to express the true essence of his code. There's some things, a big feature that's being implemented in both languages that I'm not going to talk about in this video is contravariance and covariance. This is an idea. There's some links out there. If you do a search, you'll find Eric Lippert has a whole blog series on covariance and contravariance that'll get you a lot more detail on what it is. To the developer out there, the biggest thing to realize about generic variants is that things that were broken in the type system before when using generics will simply work. The polymorphic behavior of if I have a base class and a derived class that's in an IEnumerable, we'll know that an IEnumerable of sheep in certain situations can be used in place of an IEnumerable of animal, let's say. That's something that was broken. It wasn't functional before, it now works. So one thing I want to discuss in this video that has raised a lot of questions for people is the relationship between C# and Visual Basic going forward. We've seen some pain points that have arisen in the last couple of language releases where one language will support a feature while the other language doesn't. And the problem is then perhaps a framework library will make heavy use of that feature. And all of a sudden it becomes where the other language becomes very difficult to use that framework from. This is a situation we really need to avoid. We need to make this better than we have before. And to do this, we have this approach called coevolution. If you look at the teams even organizationally here now at Microsoft, we have one managed languages team. We have 2 languages or 3 languages that we're working on, but we have the same team dedicated to it. Coevolution, think about this as kind of a rubber band effect, where if C# marches forward and does a really great feature, we're going to make sure that VB can actually slingshot back and use that same feature. They're going to co-evolve together. They're going to be a rolling stone that are kind of tied at the hip. We want them to avoid this situation where something becomes very easy, or a framework feature becomes very easy to use from C# and very painful from Visual Basic, or vice versa. We want to avoid that situation, and we're doing that through coevolution. Will this mean that some standout features won't be implemented in a language compared to the other one? Absolutely not. We don't want to stifle the amount of innovation that happens in the language space. We just want to avoid the situation where one language or the other might get left behind. These are both fully supported languages. They're both very powerful languages, and we'll be going forward with both of them for a long time to come. Now, finally, in the managed language space, this is one I'm very, very, very excited about, is the introduction of F#. It's a new functional programming language that originally grew from Don Simon Microsoft Research. It's almost like a modern, or it's in the ML family of languages and has a lot of growth that came out of the OCaml programming language. And we've now taken that from Microsoft Research, grabbed it, put it into the product, and we're going to push it forward. This is a new language that's being introduced with Visual Studio 2010 in the box. So if you get Visual Studio 2010, not only can you write programs in C#, you can write them in VB, and now you can write them in F#. What is F#? Well, I mentioned F# is a functional programming language, but really it's also a multi-paradigm language. Not only can you write in very functional programming terms and think about problems and express problems very functionally, but it's written in such a way that you can also embrace object-oriented. Since it's a .NET language, it has full interop support with C#, VB, or any other CIL-based language that's out there. So I can naturally use existing components I might have implemented in C# and use them from F#. This becomes very powerful from an adoption scenario at F#. So I can identify those situations that F# excels in and express the problems in a language that truly helps me express the real solution to a problem. Perhaps expressing it in a functional nature at its core, and use it from my C# or VB applications, or even use my existing C# and VB components from my F# application. Either way, this is a very powerful addition in Visual Studio. Now, as you'll see, as part of this video, there's some hands-on labs that we're making available via this training course to get your hands dirty with some of these features. I hope you enjoy them. We'll see you on the other side.